Today's video is sponsored by Underlucky Stars. Commemorate a special time in your life or the life of a loved one with a personalized star map. More on them in a bit.
King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and elect of God. His Imperial Majesty, Haile Selassie I.
In this channel's short lifetime, we've covered endless men who made their mark. Many became kings, emperors, leaders of movements that changed the course of history. But even among this pantheon, it's rare to find men or women who went one step further, who became not just a human figurehead, but the focal point of an entire religion. Well, in this episode, we're going to meet one such man, Haile Selassie. As a mere mortal, he reigned over the nation of Ethiopia for 44 transformative years. Yet his longest-lasting legacy likely has its roots over 12,000 kilometers away. In the Jamaica of the 1930s, the Rastafari religion coalesced around the idea that Selassie was not just a powerful man, but literally God. Today, an estimated 1 million followers of Rastafarianism subscribe to this belief. Yet, who was the historical figure at the center of it all, and how did he become this religion's messiah? Born in a mud hut, Haile Selassie rose through the ranks of Ethiopia's royal family to become its last emperor. As leader, he weathered coup attempts, invasion, and resistance to his progressive reforms, only to, at last, be overthrown by his own people. Powerful, tragic, and nuanced. This is the life of Haile Selassie, Africa's King of Kings.
There is a well-known Ethiopian folktale which tells of how Tafari's father, Ras Makonnen, governor of the Ethiopian province of Harar, was visited one day by a hermit who came to deliver a prophecy. Fighting alongside his cousin Emperor Menelik II, Makonnen had played a leading role at the famous Battle of Adwa, in which Ethiopian forces defeated Italy in a raging battle which would ultimately secure Ethiopia's status as one of only 2 African countries to have never been colonized. But despite his great military successes and political achievements, Makonnen was a man in crisis. His beloved wife had been having serious troubles with childbearing and had suffered a series of miscarriages. According to the folktale, however, Makonnen's troubles were finally resolved when the hermit delivered to him the following prophecy. This time, the child your wife is pregnant with will come into the world in the best of health and survive. He will grow up to be a fine boy, and when he is still a young man, he would rise to become ruler of Ethiopia and govern the whole country with a firm hand. He will bestow greatness and pride upon Ethiopia and make it renowned the world over. But ultimately, he will destroy everything he has built with his own hands and leave the country in ruins.
Although he's gone down in history as Haile Selassie, the future emperor was actually born Tafari Makonnen. Like his father, he was elevated to the title of Ras or Duke. It's from the fusion of his title and name, Rastafari, that Rastafarianism gets its name. And while we're on the subject, we should probably also discuss Ethiopia. If you paid attention in history class, you might be under the impression that Ethiopia in this era was called Abyssinia, which it was, but only by outsiders. For this reason, we're just going to refer to it as Ethiopia throughout, just as we'll be calling Tafari Haile Selassie, even though he wouldn't take on that name until 1930. Got it? Well, great. So let's move on with today's story. When Selassie was just a teen, his father died. But while this doubtless hurt, it also took him closer than ever to the center of power. Taken in by the emperor, Selassie became part of Addis Ababa's political elite, eventually becoming promoted all the way to governor of his dad's old province. It was while working there that Selassie began to truly grasp Ethiopia's problems. While the empire was thousands of years old, the nation itself seemed like it was stuck in the Middle Ages. Dominated by a landowning nobility, Ethiopia had few roads, few large buildings, no organized healthcare, and little in the way of government infrastructure. In essence, it was a feudal society, and that was worrying. This was the heyday of colonialism, when European powers were gobbling up so much African real estate that very, very few places hadn't been absorbed into some empire or another. Selassie was quick to define that if Ethiopia didn't modernize, it too would become little more than an exotic outpost to be exploited. But what could he do as a mere governor? Although he was related to the emperor, Selassie wasn't in line for the throne. When Menelik II died in 1913, it was the good-looking playboy Ieyasu who replaced him, not the orphan Selassie. As with his father's death, though, Selassie would soon manage to turn this latest setback into an advantage. Ieyasu had an image problem. His ancestors had been Muslim in a nation where the elite were all Christian. So, when he started making moves to desecularize society, those same elites didn't see a serious attempt to improve the lot of Ethiopia's religious minorities, but rather a diabolical plot to make them all worship Allah and stop drinking their beloved Tej. As head of the Christian opposition, Selassie led the charge in accusing Ieyasu of being an apostate, a traitor, and generally just a giant douchebag. When in 1916 Ieyasu also started making overtures to World War I Central Powers, it was the last straw. Ieyasu was overthrown that September, replaced with Menelik's daughter, Zewditu. But since the idea of female rumor was almost as bad to these guys as an Islamic emperor, it was decided Zewditu needed a regent, someone who could give her reign a shot of testosterone. Care to guess who they chose? In early 1917, Selassie was appointed Zewditu's crown prince and heir apparent. And so began his unstoppable rise to power.
With a Bible in one hand, and in the other, a copy of the iconic June 1931 issue of National Geographic magazine, preachers of a new religion known as Rastafarianism began proclaiming a new gospel. According to them, Selassie's coronation was the fulfillment of a prophecy by the Pan-African activist Marcus Garvey, who famously encouraged his supporters to look to Africa, where a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near. Despite facing strong resistance from the British colonial authorities, the new movement quickly began to grow under the leadership of his leading preacher, Leonard Howell. Defying the local authorities, Howell began proclaiming Haile Selassie as God in the flesh and urged his fellow black Jamaicans to no longer see themselves as British subjects but as Ethiopians. Howell would also claim that the emperor was arranging ships to repatriate all willing Jamaicans to the promised land of Ethiopia. Around 5,000 coronation photographs of the emperor would be reportedly reprinted and distributed amongst his followers for use as travel passports in anticipation of their redemptive journey to the land they now dreamingly refer to as Zion. But in sharp contrast to the Rastafarian vision of Ethiopia as an African paradise governed by a benevolent African messiah, the daily life of the average Ethiopian living under Emperor Haile Selassie's rule was hardly enviable. Despite his rich history and status as one of the oldest Christian civilizations in the world, Selassie's Ethiopia was far behind its European and Asian peers in terms of technological and economic progress. Like most ancient monarchies, Ethiopia under Haile Selassie's rule was essentially a feudal society in which an elite minority composed of monarchs, noblemen, and clergy exerted almost absolute dominance over a large peasant population who were kept in line through a combination of force and tradition. Despite several attempts to ban the practice, slavery was still common in many parts of the country, with an estimated 2 million people believed to have been in some form of forced servitude as at the time of Haile Selassie's coronation in 1930. Social mobility was more or less non-existent, and with the exception of the country's capital of Addis Ababa, modern innovations like electricity, road networks, and telephone lines were virtually unheard of. But perhaps the most pervasive of all of Ethiopia's structural issues was the way in which the concentration of all power and wealth in the hands of its noble families basically meant that the never-ending dramas and eternal squabbles between the empire's numerous princes, noblemen, and clergy often had very severe ramifications on the day-to-day life of the average Ethiopian subject. Although the generally low standard of living of the vast majority of Ethiopians living under Selassie's rule did not negatively affect the growth of the Rastafarian movement, the biggest test of faith for his most ardent believers would come in the year 1935, when Selassie would be forced to flee his kingdom following a violent invasion by the fascist Italian dictator Benito Mussolini.
So far in this video, we focused on the story of Haile Selassie, the man, the mortal human who became Ethiopia's emperor. But there's another story playing out there in the background, taking place at roughly the same time. The story of how Haile Selassie came to be revered as a god. Unlike our main story, this version of Selassie's tale begins in 1916, when Marcus Garvey announced to his followers, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the Redeemer." At the time, of course, Africa was mostly a patchwork of European colonies. A truly independent black king wasn't something that came along very often at all. So when Haile Selassie was crowned at a grand ceremony in 1930, it felt to many among Jamaica's poor and disenfranchised that Garvey's prophecy had come true. Over the following years, the religious teaching that Selassie was Jah incarnate began to spread over the island. Taking its name from his old title and birth name, Rastafarianism would become one of the Caribbean's great social movements, a movement turbocharged by the Italian invasion. Playing into Rastafarian concepts about Babylon, in this case colonial society, oppressing black people, the invasion became a rallying cry. When Selassie retook the throne, it only confirmed that he was the prophesied Black Messiah. This elevation in Rasta thought soon got caught up in other cultural currents swirling through Jamaica. After denouncing Selassie as a coward, Garvey changed his mind and started making Ethiopia a focal point of his Back to Africa movement. This in turn influenced Rastafaris until Selassie's kingdom came to be seen as the promised land of Zion. It probably helps that after World War II, Selassie had established a land grant around Shatamani village that black people from the Americas could settle in. Initially intended for those from the USA, it soon became a focal point of a minor wave of Rastafari immigration. Finally, in 1966, the emperor made a state visit to Jamaica, touching down in Kingston on April the 21st. So many Rastas swarmed the airport that they took over the runway, turning a working transport hub into an impromptu religious carnival. For Rastafarians, Selassie's arrival in Jamaica was effectively his second coming. To this day, April the 21st is still celebrated as Coronation Day, the day Jah walked among the ordinary men of Kingston. Yet even as Rastafarians abroad were deifying him, back home, Selassie's reign was beginning to lose its shine. The trouble was, all those young elites Selassie had encouraged into his new schools were now adults with enough education to question why they were still ruled by an autocrat. It didn't help that Selassie responded to a failed coup by forming a new government composed of the aristocracy and military elites. The impression was of an emperor no longer taking his nation forward, but rather holding it back, especially when you looked to Eritrea.
Never in the empire's over 3,000-year history did an Ethiopian emperor hold as much power and influence as Haile Selassie I. But rather ironically, it was this very fact that sealed his fate as the last in his lineage. But before any attempts to pass judgment on Selassie's time as emperor, it is perhaps useful to bear in mind the old adage, which states that the greatness of a leader only becomes clear in the light of the regime and rulers that come after him. Selassie may be rightfully denounced for his many mistakes and authoritarian approach, but the 1974 Ethiopian revolution, which overthrew his imperial rule, would open the floodgates to an era of terror and lawlessness on a scale never before seen in the country's history. Like many other revolutions and uprisings before it, the Ethiopian Revolution would ultimately ravage its own children. The political instability and infighting that followed the emperor's overthrow would see over 1 million Ethiopians lose their lives, and an even larger number either displaced or plunged into absolute poverty. And so perhaps when future generations judge Selassie's 60-year reign as regent and emperor, they just might conclude that his services to his country carried more weight than the many great mistakes which he undoubtedly made.
In 1962, Ethiopia had dissolved its federation with its northern neighbor in favor of outright annexation. This had led to an insurgency erupting that tied up the army and brought in a constant flood of bad news. There was about to get even worse. As the 1960s rolled on, other ethnicities within Ethiopia's patchwork of peoples would begin to stage their own revolts. He may have just been recognized as the living incarnation of God, but the mortal man who was Haile Selassie would soon have a much bigger problem, making sure that living was exactly what he continued to do. By the close of the 1960s, it was clear Ethiopia was in trouble. In the cities, socialist-inspired students were agitating for land reform. As their Leninist doctrine spread, so did the idea that ethnicities should have the right to secede, a right many disaffected groups eagerly grasped. Soon uprisings were springing up alongside the conflict in Eritrea. Gojam erupted, as did Sidamo and Tigray. But it was in Wollo that the match would be lit on the pile of resentful dynamite now underlying society. In 1971, a terrible drought struck Ethiopia, laying waste to the countryside. That year, food stocks had to be eaten to supplement the terrible harvest. When drought again hit the following year, even the seeds and the grain was consumed. All of this led to an inevitable and horrific outcome in 1973. Famine. Today, it's unknown exactly how many died in the Wollo famine, although estimates place it at around 200,000 people. But the real problem was Selassie's reaction. Rather than beg the international community for help, the emperor tried to hide what was happening, even throwing sumptuous banquets to cover up the food scarcity. So when the news finally broke, it made the emperor not just look callous, but actively cruel. And that tipped the scales from "we need reform" to "that has to go." In June 1974, following 6 months of strikes, rioting and chaos, a bunch of military officials and self-proclaimed socialists formed a committee known as the Derg. On September the 12th, they overthrew Selassie in a coup, dragging him from his palace as crowds jeered and shouted insults. Initially, the Derg wanted to place Selassie's son on the throne, but when Crown Prince Asfor refused to go along with them, the Derg were all like, "Alright, fine, I guess we'll just rule by ourselves then." The announcement of a communist state on December the 20th effectively ended the Ethiopian monarchy after 3,000 years. In its place came a military junta that would take Ethiopia into a series of wars and famine, far more terrible than anything that happened on Selassie's watch. But the last emperor wouldn't be around to see it. On August the 27th, 1975, the Derg tersely announced that Selassie had died of natural causes. While that's not impossible for a man of 83, many still believe he was murdered, especially given his final resting place. After the fall of the Derg in 1992, Selassie's bones were found entombed in concrete beneath the private toilet of the Derg's leader, Colonel Mengistu. It would take until November 2000 for his relatives to finally receive an official reburial. Today, as when the emperor was alive, there exist two Haile Selassies. One is the Selassie of Rasta thought, a black spiritual leader that a million people worship and millions more have heard about. This Selassie is an icon, not just for his role in Rastafarianism, but for being a powerful African leader at a time when most of Africa was subjugated. But there's also another Selassie, one who started out as a reformer only to wind up being consumed by his inability to reform as fast as his people needed. This Selassie is all too human, a remarkable man, but still just a man, and one who, sadly, ended his reign not beloved, but driven from power. Whichever Selassie you believe in, though, there's no doubting his historical significance. As the last emperor of Ethiopia, Selassie guided one of Africa's most important countries through an era of bloodshed and change that effectively turned a medieval society into a modern state.
Fox Movie Tone brings you the world's news. Lowell Thomas speaking.
Rome. In a blazing radio address, Mussolini proclaims his decision: war. Despite the League of Nations, Italy will conquer Ethiopia. Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie protests to the League that the Italians have already invaded Ethiopia. So the Emperor orders complete mobilization. He marshals his hosts of fighting men to defend his frontiers. The Emperor broadcasts an impassioned plea to the outside world to save Ethiopia from Italian conquest. The President of the Ethiopian Parliament speaks, and an American radio man introduces the Emperor especially to America.
Hello, America. This is Addis Ababa.
Qu'il souhaite ardemment et qu'il leur est indispensable.
He defends his country's cause, calls upon the world to stop the war, and declares that Ethiopia is firmly for peace.
Salam passé. Le peuple éthiopien est fermement attaché à la paix, mais Il est en même temps
A nation praying for peace but ready to fight to the last. Rome deciding war. The League of Nations preparing to impose penalties. The clash of arms, the thunders of battle seem more terrifying, as at the radio station of Addis Ababa, the Emperor Haile Selassie pleads for peace.
et l'assiste dans leur effort.
Once again, it's KB Tyro for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video.